How can we fight misinformation in science? That's the topic of today's live stream. I'm Adriel Briscoe here with Wikilection, and we'll jump right in. So in this presentation, we'll be going through a few slides to show how Wikilection plans to use evidence and expert feedback to support the discussion of controversial issues. Now, the session is named around science and controversial science, but in the end, this can be used for really anything that you rely on expert feedback for. So some examples that aren't science might be something like an economic paper, or even the types of things that a journalist might use to prove that their story is true, or that something happened. So at the core of the evidence that Wikilection will be using will be sort of the content itself. So in the example here, because we're talking about science, this would be something like a scientific study. And so what we'd end up with is we will actually be storing the study itself if possible, or we might link out to it if we're not allowed to. But whenever possible, we would want to sort of have the information stored directly so that it sort of can't be changed or taken away. And within the content itself, so the content will provide the details of the study, or of the actual thing that we're looking at for the evidence. The content is then broken down into snippets, and snippets are the smaller pieces of content that you can reference, and you can have sort of any level. So you can have an entire paragraph or a page be a snippet, and then within that you can have smaller snippets where it's just one or two lines. And then with both of those together, the full content itself and the snippets, then you can have a review of that content by experts. And that might involve, as it says here, a review of the entire study, or it might just be certain snippets. So if you've got a popular scientific study that people like to reference, and it might be a certain stat that came out of that, 38% of people do X, then you might have more experts chiming in on that particular snippet from that study, especially if it's referencing something else that then you can sort of go into the details. But that is how the information is sort of broken out in the content, the snippets, and then the review of the whole thing. So the reviews would also sort of track and store who wrote that review, so that just like we'll have information available on politicians and people in various roles, part of the goal is to figure out who wrote this review, so that we can track things about them that might be important. And that might be things like, why are they qualified, or how are they qualified? And it might also be things like, are there any conflicts of interest? So yeah, here we got the overview of a review is sort of the typical review that you might see now. So if somebody goes through and does a review of a scientific study, and they write, a 1 or a 2 or a 10-page review of that study, the goal is that they can still do that. Now, one of the unique parts is going to be bringing in the snippets into those reviews. So while the full review is still possible, we do want to make sure that sort of as much as possible, the review also contains sort of individual reviews of the important snippets. So it lets the author of the review highlight what they feel is the most important. And then it will also make it easier for the community to dissect both the content and then the reviews of that content. So for the snippets, how they're structured is it stores what's called here the short form, or that is sort of the shortest piece of the snippet. And that is an example of that. If you were going to reference a study, for a common stat that came out of it, that's an example of one snippet, kind of in its smallest form, saying, according to this piece of content, 38% of people do X. That's your short form snippet. Then with each snippet, it's important that you can sort of drill in a little bit more and see the context of the nearby information that's about. So if there is a single sentence that says 38% of people do something, we do want to make sure that you can't just cherry pick a single line or sort of cut out the before and after and lose context that might be important. And so you can see here on the left, it's got the individual snippet. Unfortunately, it's not in English because it's lorem ipsum thick text, but this is meant to show sort of that information in the orange part would be the snippet itself, and then it's going to give you the context of the information before and after it, so that you can make sure that you are keeping that context. And then for each individual snippet, you've got one or more reviews from experts, hopefully, that sort of say, is this snippet itself sort of honest and or accurate, but then you can also start to review how people are referencing that snippet. So if people are maybe dishonestly or at least inaccurately referencing some content from a study, that's part of the purpose here, is to allow experts to say, so here's what the snippet usually is claimed to say, but here's what the study is actually saying. Now, when we're talking about evidence and sort of whether or not it can or should be trusted, it's important to note there's both the evidence quality and then there's how it's being referenced. So unless you're actually the expert going in there and fully reviewing that content, generally speaking, most of us will rely on experts to sort of summarize the important information for us. And so that gives us two places where things can go wrong. When experts are reviewing the content, they're reviewing the content itself, right? So is that study, if we're talking about a scientific study, was it designed properly? Were there any conflicts of interest? Did the outcome, sort of what they're saying that they learned, did it match what the study actually explained happened? That sort of thing. And so this is, a simplified version just showing if it's a high or a low quality piece of evidence. But the goal is to be able to say, hey, the evidence that's supporting this certain claim, is it good or not? Is that actual scientific study good? Does it meet the necessary criteria for trustworthy trustworthy science? And then going back to a moment ago when I was talking about people will be referencing those claims, right? So if you're talking about in the news or in a politician's speech or wherever you might hear people starting to claim these sort of stats to prove or disprove something, you can try to reference it accurately, or you might be referencing it inaccurately. And so you end up with this situation where two different streams sort of could be right or wrong. And really the sweet spot is where you've got a really good high quality piece of content, or hopefully a few of them. And when experts have reviewed them, they've said, yeah, that's a good quality piece of evidence for whatever purpose, and it's reasonable to trust that the person sort of did that properly. And then when somebody is referencing it, ideally, of course, you want them to reference it in a way that's honest and accurate. And when you look at the context of the actual study itself, it still matches and it still makes sense. So you want both of those things. Now, we'll commonly see situations where you might have somebody honestly try to reference a piece of content, but the content isn't that good. So, they actually did say, they were accurate in saying what the paper said, but when experts go and look at that paper, they say, actually, it's not good for these reasons. And so then, even if you're honestly referencing it, if the content itself that's being referenced isn't good, that doesn't really help anyone. And then you can have a really high quality piece of evidence that that experts have reviewed and said, yeah, that's trustworthy. But if you're inaccurately referencing it, then it's no longer useful, because now you're not taking the full context of what we actually learned from that study. And people either maybe intentionally or unintentionally trying to skew it in a certain way. And then there's kind of the worst case scenario where somebody takes a piece of low quality evidence and inaccurately references it, and that's just never going to be useful to anyone. So when we're looking at the discussion of a controversial topic, this is a very simplistic way of looking at how we might be able to break that down. So up top, we have the very sort of simple stances of being for or against something. Underneath those, you've got the claims that are being used to support those stances. And so you can see up top, right, there's the one that's for, that's showing in green, and the colors here are meant to show sort of how trustworthy that stance or that claim appears to be based on the underlying information. So without even looking at the bottom row for evidence, you can tell that what we're trying to show here is that the stance for something has more evidence sort of showing, yeah, that side's probably more accurate. And then the against is, not as good. It's showing orange, so it's showing that there's maybe some problems here and there isn't a lot of evidence backing it up. So when we look at the underlying evidence, the example here shows 5 different articles. And then there's some letters underneath showing the different claims that those might support. And we can see that Article 1 is sort of being used, it's reasonable to assume that it could back up claims, A, B, C, and D, it's saying. And so in this case, because it backs up claim A, it's being used as the supporting evidence for claim A, but so is Article 2 and Article 5. So these arrows underneath are pointing to the claim that sort of they're supporting. Now, the color of the evidence is meant to indicate how trustworthy that evidence is and how accurately it's being portrayed. So kind of both pieces at once. And we can see that of the 3 that are supporting claim A, articles 1 and 2 are green, so that's good. And then Article 5 is gray, so we aren't really sure. It's not good or bad, it's just we don't have enough information yet. And so that's actually got some pretty reasonable claims to say that based on the evidence available, that's probably true. Now, if we look at claim C, it's not quite as dark green. That's because it doesn't have quite as much information. It's also backed up by Article 1, which again is green, so that's good. And it's backed up by Article 5, which is that gray where we're not sure. So it does have some supporting information, just not as much as claim A. So it's meant to show that, hey, this is still probably good, but it could use a bit more information, and a bit more sort of backup showing it's true. And then we're looking at the sole claim for the against side, which is showing as orange. And if we see underneath, that's being supported by Article 3 and Article 5. And Article 3 is showing as orange, which means that either it was reviewed by experts and said, this has some problems, or it might be a decent study, but just when it's being used to support claim E, it's not great, right? Like they're not doing it honestly or accurately. And then again, it's trying to reference Article 5, but we still don't know anything about it. So any claim that's trying to support itself with Article 5 isn't sort of seeing points for or against it. It's just not that useful either way yet. And so because claim E has that one that we aren't sure, and the one that's inaccurate, its only claim, the only evidence supporting that claim is on the inaccurate side. So now it's showing, hey, that's not great. And of course, again, this is very simplified. You would end up with hopefully a lot more content showing, right? So for each claim, you might have 10 or 20 or more pieces of evidence backing it up. And then we're trying to show the sort of, I guess, the average or the summary of all the available information. So just because a side has, 1 or 2 pieces of information that maybe aren't great, if you've got a lot more information backing you up that is credible and it's being reviewed and it's being accurately portrayed, then that would still end up being a net positive. But whereas if most or all the information you're using to support your claim or your stance, if that is, either not reviewed or sort of suspect quality for the evidence itself or it being referenced, then you would start to see that reflecting negatively on both the stance and the claims. Now you might end up where you've got one stance being supported by good and bad. And the bad doesn't necessarily mean that the stance is bad. It just means that particular claim, that particular claim maybe doesn't hold water. So if you're looking at something that, it's got 10 claims and 8 of them are positive and 2 of them are negative, we're really just after the positive ones. If something is overwhelmingly negative that might start to show, hey, the people participating in this conversation maybe aren't being the most authentic or honest, or we might just not have a way to represent their like what they're trying to show yet. Something this won't be great at to start with are sort of the more like personal values, like something that eventually we're hoping to include, but it's hard to sort of plan for at this stage, is something like your stance on something because of a religious value. That's going to be harder to sort of prove or disprove. This is sort of focusing more on the things that you can measure, and sort of trying to show that. But in the end, we would hopefully be able to at least look at a piece of content and say, hey, this, you might even be able to back up a religious claim at some point by using evidence like from the Bible or something and saying, hey, here's what the Bible says. Here's what religious experts say about something. And you might do it that way. That's getting less into sort of the provable as true and more just the opinions of people involved at the various levels, which is kind of what the experts are technically doing anyway. So that might not be the worst thing. So that is it for the science portion. This is likely going to be the last of these biweekly live streams, sort of going over this content, because we're actually working on the first, I guess, alpha version of Wikilection. There's actually a developer working on it, so we'll be focusing on that. And in the coming weeks, we should actually start to see some content around trying to solve the problems from, whatever is possibly blocking us, or questions that we might have to decide what comes next in the coded version. But if you are watching these, thank you for your time, and feel free to reach out on either Facebook or the website. And the YouTube channel is also a pretty good source. Let me actually jump back to that first slide, because that has the best ways to reach us. The best way right now is probably Facebook, because that's both a source of information and a way to actually reach us. The website isn't the most up-to-date, but still has some pretty good sources of information. And the website will also have a link to YouTube. Or you could just search for Wikilection, and it will likely be the only thing that shows up. So thank you again for your time, and hope to see you in future live streams and other ways that we're interacting with you. Thanks. Bye.